Hello, and welcome everyone to day two of the conference. This is really the official start of the 2020 Community Indicators Consortium Annual Conference. I am Chantal Stevens with Community Indicators Consortium, and it's my privilege and pleasure on behalf of the Community Indicator Consortium to welcome you here today. CIC's vision is that community indicators, community data, or just local disaggregated data will be used by all communities to facilitate sustainable improvement in quality of life. Community indicators help communities answer the question, are we there yet? They measure what communities care about and track whether the community is moving in the right direction. Without indicators, it is difficult to know whether progress is being made or important issues are being addressed. Those metrics provide essential guidance for action and key tools for appropriate engagement of the public. With this year's theme, Building Resilience with Community Data, we see a powerful role for community indicators as the building block for a resilient world. We pivoted to resilience when it became clear that we, the United States in particular, but much of the world as well, were not prepared to face the type of disruption, the human and economic cost that was being forced upon us by the pandemic. Resilience is the capacity of all of a community's parts. It's individuals, families, institutions, charities, businesses, and all of its systems to survive, adapt, and grow, no matter what kind of chronic stress and acute shock they experience. We are currently experiencing a host of those chronic stresses and acute shocks, and we hope that the 2020 Impact Summit will help in a small way share the tools and knowledge that communities need to build resilience on a foundation of indicators that are meaningful, actionable, and timely. Over the rest of this week, you are invited to attend over 65 presentations organized within 9 different conference sessions, touching on a wide variety of topics from place-based founders to children and youth, community engagement to sustainable development goals, among others, but all of them through the prism of resilience, equity, and sustainability. Before we start this keynote session, well anticipated, I have a few small housekeeping announcements. All attendees are muted throughout the course of the presentations. However, we encourage conversations and participation. Please use the chat box to comment to everyone or to a specific person. Enter questions in the Q&A section or upvote somebody else's question. If you would like to ask a question out loud, please use the hand-raising icon at the bottom of the chat box. When your name is mentioned, please turn on your microphone and webcam to ask a question or discuss a point. If you'd like to connect with a presenter or the attendees or anyone, we have opened a 24/7 meeting room that everyone has access to. So before passing the screen to our CIC president, Frank Rizzi, who will be introducing our keynote speaker, I wanted to briefly recognize that and thanks some of the conference planning committee members who are present today. Alail Ray, who chaired the committee, Jennifer Tenner, Lorenza Gutierrez, David Abraham, Luis Estevez, Ken Lee, Nancy Watson, and Frank Rizzi. And so Frank, first, thank you all for your great work planning this conference, getting it off the ground and into the virtual universe. And now, Frank, all yours.
Thank you, Chantal. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you. It is now my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. Angela Glover Blackwell is the founder in residence at PolicyLink, the organization she started in 1999 to advance racial and economic equity for all. Under Angela's leadership, PolicyLink gained national prominence in the movement to use public policy to improve access and opportunity for all low-income people and communities of color, particularly in the areas of health, housing, transportation, and infrastructure, all areas that we care very much about here at the Community Indicators Consortium. Her Radical Imagination podcast debuted in September of 2019, introducing listeners to a world of creative, progressive thinkers whose vision is challenging the status quo to create the change we need. On Radical Imagination, they don't just talk about big issues like inequality, racism, and housing insecurity. They actually meet the people creating bold, inspiring solutions designed to deliver equity wins at scale. Prior to founding PolicyLink, Angela served as Senior Vice President at the Rockefeller Foundation. A lawyer by training, she gained national recognition as founder of the Urban Strategies Council. Angela is the co-author of Uncommon Common Ground, Race and America's Future, and she authored The Curb Cut Effect, published in the Stanford Social Innovation Review in 2017. A leading voice in the movement for equity in America, in 2020, Angela was appointed by California Governor Gavin Newsom to the State Task Force on Business and Jobs Recovery. She's the 2018 recipient of the John W. Gardner Leadership Award, presented by the Independent Sector, and in 2017, she received the Peter E. Haas Public Service Award from the University of California at Berkeley. It is now my great pleasure and honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Angela Glover Blackwell. Please, Angela, welcome.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you for that lovely introduction. It is such a pleasure to be with you. I am a fan of people who do indicators, community indicators, neighborhood indicators, indicators of our well-being. And I think that it is a surprise to a lot of us that this would be the moment for people who understand indicators, because this is an unusual time that we are living in. I must say that having been an activist for over 40 years and really been deepening my knowledge constantly about what the challenge is for the nation and what the best ways are to build a fully inclusive society, I never expected to see a time so ripe with transformative possibility. That's what we have right now. The confluence of health, the economy, and race brought about by COVID-19's impact, particularly on people of color, particularly people of color who have been victims of a system that has isolated them from the health benefits that they need, concentrated people of color in communities that lack those things that create health and well-being, like access to fresh fruits and vegetables, safe place to live, a job that actually brings about security, living in a community that is really full of the tension that comes with living in a racist society and being the one who is on the receiving end of that hostility. All of those things make people's health very vulnerable. And we see now what that means. But we're also seeing something else in terms of this moment. And that is that the people who have been most marginalized in society are key to keeping the economy running. And we're seeing what happens when we have a pandemic and people who are essential and frontline workers who are overwhelmingly people of color, people in marginalized occupations, who, when they can't work, America cannot work. And that is being understood. Right in the middle of this extraordinary moment in the nation, we have had a racial awakening brought about by the viewing of the murder of George Floyd, for sure. But building before that, we had something happening in this country for a good 5 to 7 years before that, where many people were being forced to look at race and racism, to name it, to understand that it goes beyond what people carry in their hearts, and it was baked into society. And so here we are at this moment with the confluence of health, the economy, and race, with an urgency to be able to figure out how do we go forward, but also a demand coming from many people that as we try to get through the pain and horror that we're in, that recovery cannot be to what we were, because there's so much evidence now that what we were made us particularly vulnerable to what we're in right now. And so people who are able to make some sense out of that, to be able to add clarity to the who, to be able to add specificity to the exactly who, and to be able to understand how those things are reinforcing one upon the other, that's the work that you do. This is your moment. And it is so important that you're aware of it. I often say one of the most important things for people to be able to do if they want to make change is to be able to tell time, to know what time it is, to know what's right for your ideas, to know when your ideas are being accepted and it's time to move on, to understand when you need to linger because there may be the possibility to move more people into your space if you just wait for them for a minute. So understanding the power of the moment is important, and this is your moment. But as people have been thinking about these issues of economy and health and how they all interact with race, it's also important that people understand place. Years ago, Frank mentioned it in the introduction. It was 1987, in fact. I started the Urban Strategies Council in Oakland, California. And I started it after having spent a decade as a public interest lawyer, working on employment discrimination, consumer issues, rights of the elderly, children's issues, all through a public advocacy point of view. One of the things that I recognize is that local communities really had extraordinary power and freedom and creativity to be able to solve these problems that we were trying to attack in the courts and at the national level. And that led me to start a local community building organization, and that was Urban Strategies Council. And the first thing we did was begin to gather data to tell the story about where we were and what the opportunities were to be able to move forward. The first thing that we did, and I think this came out probably in 1988, was a report called A Chance for Every Child. And think, this was 1988. People were not yet using GIS systems in community to try to talk about change. We told the story of persistent poverty in Oakland by taking just a blank sheet of paper and making gray the census tracts that were 30% or more people of poverty, people living in poverty. And then we took transparent overlays and we identified infant mortality, low birth weight, families headed by women, youth who were idle, unemployed, not in school, poverty rates. And not poverty rates, but also education and educational achievement. And we laid it over those census tracts. And sure enough, they lined up. That led us to a whole lot of work and a whole lot of finding colleagues across the country who understood what we were trying to do in terms of showing the impacts of concentrated poverty, very much influenced by the work of William Julius Wilson. That led to us getting a GIS system and showing how you could put all of this on a computer and create technology. But the insight for us was that we were able to capture the imagination of the people of Oakland, California, and the people of Alameda County, where Oakland sits, to be able to understand with specificity exactly what it was that we needed to attack, where it was, who it was happening to, and how we could know if we were making progress. From that moment on, I became a convert for if you want change, you must use data to understand what change you need. And that's where we are right now, because while people may understand the racial dimension of what's going on, they don't quite get this place dimension of it. Not only is race important, not only is class important, but place is important. And getting people to understand that place doesn't just mean New York State or New York City. You can look within New York. And when you look within New York, or you look within the city of San Francisco, or you look within the city of Minneapolis, any of those places, you can use data to zoom into neighborhoods and begin to understand the place effect on all of these things that people are worried about. It is so important for local practitioners, for local leaders, for local activists, and for people in neighborhoods to understand, which is one of the reasons that we hear so many demands for adequate testing and tracking now to get out of this crisis. Because if we could understand the places that where this is happening more, if we could understand more about the vulnerability that we sense at a gross sense, but we don't understand it exquisitely, we could begin to plan to use our resources effectively. But this moment, while it is so ripe with telling the story that we have been needing to tell for so long, it is also ripe as a moment in which we could really make some change. Because This didn't just happen. This is centuries in the making, this vulnerability that we're seeing now. It goes back to the beginning when people came to this land. It goes back to stealing the land from the indigenous people who were already here. It goes back to the genocide of indigenous people. It goes back to slavery and human bondage. But most importantly, it goes back to the narrative that allowed all of those things to be justified. This country was actually built on a hierarchy of human value, in which this narrative that justifies a hierarchy of human value has been running in the background. So it made it okay in the minds of people who were doing it to slaughter the indigenous people. It made it okay to steal land. It made it okay to place people in bondage and to build the nation on slave labor. That hierarchy of human value is so baked into the society that it has the power now to jump to any place that serves the economy. So that we're actually having a conversation about sacrificing people who are elderly for the economy. And it's not just sacrificing elderly Latinx people or Black people, it's sacrificing elderly white people too. A hierarchy of human value, if you think of it as being a disease, it can jump hosts. It can jump out of people of color into people who are elderly and white. It can jump out of people of color into the white working class. And we see what happens when people are throwaway. Being able to gather data and to understand that as we're gathering it, as we're bringing it forward, as we're finding indicators that begin to tell the story of where we are and where we need to be, that we have some things that we have to know that we are consciously working against. And one of them has to be the destruction of a narrative that reinforces a hierarchy of human value. It has placed the country in a vulnerable position, and the country will not thrive until it really accepts that all people matter. All people matter. The other thing that we have to really make sure that we're attacking is a notion that some people reach to be able to say, oh, no, there's not a hierarchy of human value based on race. If it exists at all, it's based on class. We've gotten beyond the racial dimensions. Post-racial is a term that people tried to throw out after President Obama was elected. To think that, oh, no, it's not race. Look at all the wealthy entertainers. Look, we had a Black president of the United States. No, it's not race. It's just class. That if we could just focus on that, we'd be all right. Those of you who are looking at the data, you know that's not true. You know that there is an intersection of race and poverty, an intersection of race and class in this country that locks in poverty. That we have allowed inequality in this country to become absolutely toxic, baking in inequality, baking in poverty, stalling economic mobility, destroying the middle class. These things have to do with an economy that is based on a hierarchy of human value that can discount the value of many people, but the values are so baked in, it's now an economy that is completely distorted, dysfunctional, and not serving us well. It is important to be able to bring these things forward as we are thinking about how to be able to tell the story of what we're doing. It's one of the reasons that I have started the podcast that Frank referred to called Radical Imagination. But it is also one of the reasons why you need to be thinking about the role of data in a moment that is filled with the possibility for revolution. I know that the word revolution can be scary for some people, but think of it not as a violent moment. Think of it not as something to be afraid of, but think it as something that can lead to transformation. The revolution that founded the country was certainly based on violence, but it also created the possibility for something that the world needed as an experiment. And while it's still an experiment, it's still a quest to create a more perfect union, and it will probably always be seeking that perfection. The experiment allows for the very pushback and the demands that it has been receiving in recent decades. But also think about the Industrial Revolution. Think about how it it certainly had its moments of violence as we think about labor and all of those tensions. But when we think of the Industrial Revolution, we really think about opening up a realm of possibilities for human development. And some of the things that we had to do by hand, we could begin to do by machine, creating the possibility of something like leisure, something like quests for knowledge. Think of all the things that happened. Think of the development of the automobile and how it transformed the way that we live. People began to realize you didn't have to live near your nuclear family. You could begin to spread out. You could begin to think about what area you wanted to live in. Revolutions open up possibility. And I feel that we're in a revolutionary moment right now because think about it, and you know this better than anyone. We're rapidly becoming a nation in which the majority will be people of color by 2044, thereabouts. And we know who's being disproportionately left behind. It's the very people who are going to make up the majority. That we're at a point where the fate of the nation is dependent on the very people who have been left behind. And so we know that in order for the very people who have been left behind, who've been left behind because the systems have baked in this hierarchy of human value. So even when systems serve people, they serve them to provide safety nets, not steps and trampolines and ladders that allow people to reach their full potential, but safety nets that just keep people from falling completely to the bottom. It's because of the way we view their value. Think of the transformation that it's going to take for us to really work for equity, just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. Think what that's going to take. It's going to take a revolution. We have known that since the beginning of the nation, when the American Revolution was left unfinished, leaving Black people in slavery, leaving women without the ability to participate, leaving Native Americans on reservations without their land, without their dignity. That think about that always required a revolution. And we're now at the moment when it could happen because the nation will not thrive if it doesn't happen. And so what's your role in a revolutionary moment? Accept that it is that, or that it has the possibility, and know that your data can embolden activists. Activists have a vision. People who are activists, I say they have a superpower because they actually can look at what is and they can dream about what could be different. They can actually envision it to the point that rather than focusing their energies on themselves and their families alone, they begin to think about the broader society. They begin to think about the sacrifices that they can make. But they often do it based on vision and dreams and hope. What they need is data and information to be able to say what feels wrong to you is wrong. Here, look at this. What feels possible to you could have the result that you want. Look at what could happen. It can embolden the activists. But also, it can win over the sympathies of those who are our sympathetic critics. There are a lot of people who criticize because they don't, one, they think it's helpful. Two, they don't quite have the faith to be able to go with the dreamers. And three, they're a little more comfortable with the status quo, but they're sympathetic nonetheless. Data can push them over to be able to say, how do I partner with you? How do I become an ally? How do I, with my skepticism, begin to talk about this in ways that make people listen to me? The data can do that. It can also push those who are opposed to change to the side. It can marginalize them. You always have people who just don't want it to happen. Some of them are just so afraid, and we see that now. People who see the change, and I often describe the situation for those people who just want to go back, that they're being nostalgic for a time that never was while ignoring a future that is inevitable. When they say, oh, we want it like it was, it's like, really? You want it like it was when so many people who were Latinx were toiling in the fields, not able to go to school, farm workers who were just concentrated in areas where their labor was breaking their backs and there was no ability to be able to move forward. You want to go back to Jim Crow? You want to go back to legal segregation where people had to drink out of the colored water fountain. You want to go back to children with disabilities at the school at all, sitting in the back of the classroom with nobody paying any attention to them? Do you want to go back to men and women with all kinds of dreams and capabilities, not being able to fulfill any of them, to be able to have the satisfaction of doing that, or take care of their families? Step for a time that never was. It's been good for us a time. And ignoring a future ignoring a future that's inevitable, we're becoming a nation in which the majority will be people of color. That will happen. That will happen no matter what we do. We need to think about how that is an asset and embrace it. And so data can begin to push those people who are just afraid aside. It can begin to marginalize those people who are just mean. So you can see their meanness that is not fact-based. The data can be so important. And here's the most important thing it can do. It can guide people once they're ready for a change to understanding how to get to that change. Because revolutionary, transformative change does not happen if we don't measure how we're doing. We need to have a North Star, and it needs to be a results-based North Star. We need to know who, how much, how many, how long, how will we know when we get there? And when we know exactly what that is, we need to measure all along the way so that we can feel and see the indicators. The indicators guide us to the North Star. And so while this moment may just seem so confusing, frightening to many, full of hope, but not clear how you extract from hope a real change, the work that you do can just be so, and I'm honored that you have asked me to be able to open what looks like a terrific few days of intense conversation and study and exploration. And I hope you will keep me informed whether any of what I said actually turns out to be applicable in your conversations, or as you go back. Sorry to say go back home, but we are all home, aren't we? As we go into our work in our homes to try to make a difference. It's been my pleasure, and I would like to stop now and see if there are a few questions that we could, that I could answer, a few things that we could talk about together. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Angela. I know everyone's clapping and in their homes or place of work. What a fantastic message. I do want to let everyone know that we are open now for questions. Please go ahead and add your questions, type them in. I want to thank you, though, Angela, for such a timely and timeless message, but yet one that I hope will be obsolete very soon, in that we won't have to worry about these types of, these divisions and these rankings, these hierarchies that have, as you pointed out, been in the making for hundreds of years. So as we wait for questions, I'll just comment that, your message is about needing a North Star, a measurable North Star, and the importance of this for not only helping people who want to take action, to guide their action, but also to, push people over who are on the fence or maybe not sure, or having formed their opinions not based on data. That's one that really strikes home for us in the community indicators community. And it makes me think of some of the work of some of our colleagues, Katie O'Connell, Nisha Botchway, Andrea King, who some of their work is actually featured in the most recent volume of the community indicators work. And they're working on measuring the Dream Index. So, looking at their work, and you can find that in that book, where they've measured over time the disparity along racial lines. It is a black-white comparison, and you can see, hopefully, in a hopeful sense, there are some improvements. But looking at that change in criminal justice, which has been very flat over time, really helped me to see, in addition to what friends and colleagues, neighbors have said about being pulled over themselves and having experiences that were degrading, really helped to see the frustration in a way that was really tangible, as you say, Angela, and helped me to see that we are still nowhere near parity. This is it's on a scale where you can see that these horrible things are happening at a much higher level to Black members of our community. And it's kind of like the equal pay day kind of a thing, where you notice that oh, it's not until April that women earn the same as their male counterparts from the year before. You can see this racial equity is still not there. And so as you're talking, I'm thinking of their work. I'm thinking of how important and helpful it is to have such measures. Are there measures that you find helpful? Are there things that help to guide your work? And I think you've alluded to that in what you've done in Oakland, but that bring that specificity to your work.
I went way back to when I started the Urban Strategies Council. As you know, in 1999, I founded PolicyLink. And from the moment that PolicyLink started, and we began to talk about equity and defined it as just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential, we knew that we had to do more data work. And then it was about 2008 or 9 when we anticipated that we were becoming a nation that would get to be majority people of color earlier than 2050. We were anticipating that even before that data came out from looking at other data. We began to look as we went into the Great Recession at how we were having a coming together of the shifting demographics and the falling apart of the economy. And we began to say, if we could get the equity agenda right, we could get the economy right. And we began to declare, in fact, equity is the superior growth model. That declaration began to catch on, and we recognized that we could use some data to be able to strengthen the argument. And it was through that we joined with Manuel Pastor at the University of Southern California and Sarah Truehalf, who you all know very well, at PolicyLink, led the work at PolicyLink, working with Manuel's shop to be able to develop the National Equity Atlas. And the National Equity Atlas really gets at the data that we need to make this argument about the economy. And so those indicators, one, looking at the shifting demographic, but looking at the economic indicators in terms of median income, education levels, distance and time it takes to be able to get to a job, the training that people have, and those kinds of issues, looking at economic indicators to be able to look at who's being left behind. And then to make the declaration at the end using GDP data that if we get rid of discrimination in employment, that we would actually improve outcomes for the entire economy. And so we have really been using data at the national level, but at looking at states, looking at the 100 largest regions, looking at the 100 largest cities. But what we recognize is that we needed to be more specific within the Latino community, within the Asian community, to be able to really understand what's going on. So we have found that data has been so helpful on the economy. But I also think that the data about the criminal justice system has been extraordinary. And that is a now moment that we really are beginning to understand that nothing manifests the baked in structural racism more than the criminal justice system. It is so baked in that it doesn't matter who the judge is, who the police officers are, that the system works against people who are Black and brown and poor. That intersection operates there with an efficiency of negativity that is extraordinary. And the data shows that. And so criminal justice data really has a moment where we're having one of the most important debates that this country has had. I know that the cry to defund the police is scary to some people, energizing to others, but you cannot deny that it puts the issue squarely on the table about systems that work in a way that perpetuate the worst that racism can possibly produce, taking away life, taking away liberty, destroying families, and destroying community.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very helpful. We're starting to get questions coming in now, and I'm going to try to, they keep moving around, so I'll do my best to share them. We have one from Jessica Jones. Thank you so much, Angela. I just signed up for your podcast. Well, that's great.
Thank you.
Her question is, with the COVID-19 pandemic, we're seeing inequalities arise and gain more attention that have always been there. What guidance do you have in going forward with this work amidst the pandemic?
Well, I think that being able to provide explanations for what people are seeing. First, we need to keep bringing forward the data that talks about who is most vulnerable in this moment. Be able to really show that it is people in some communities who are Latinx, in some communities who are Black, in some communities who are indigenous, to be able to show the confluence of other things with death and hospitalizations so that people don't blame the people to whom it is happening. We need to show these are people who are doing the frontline jobs, who without having to without volunteering to be heroic, they have putting their lives on the line because they don't have the luxury, as most of us have, to work at home. Who are the people doing these jobs and what are their racial and place-based characteristics? Tell that story so people understand that. Tell the story of why people are having conditions like diabetes that many communities don't have the same rates of. What is it about what you eat, where you live, kind of stresses that you have? Being able to link the data points together. That's what we need to do right now so that people see something in front of them that is troubling, and we help them to understand that this is not random and this is not because people are just happen to be there. It is because of what society has done to them. The more people can see this in a moment when their curiosity is up, because it's coming into their homes every day on the news, the more we can set a soil in which we can make the changes that we need to make.
Very helpful. Thank you. Connecting to the point of now is the opportunity. We have a transformative possibility. We have another question from Linda Liu. Thank you for your inspiring words. I work and live in Oakland and love the work you've done. My question, I really value your statement of hierarchy of human values. I work very closely with data and value it, but also see how data can also be constraining and reinforce a hierarchy of human values that further embed dominant ideologies. How do you work with that or find perspective on how to find that balance and caveat with data?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that wonderful question. And my answer right before it began to get at it. People who are already oriented to think that white people are superior can find reinforcement in the data when it shows that white people are better educated, when it shows that white people are healthier, when it shows that white people are more successful in entrepreneurship, when it shows that white people live in healthier neighborhoods. One could conclude that they're just smart enough to move to those neighborhoods, creative enough to start those businesses, et cetera. And therefore, it is so important to be able to show what is happening to the people who have been left behind, the kind of education that people are getting, state-sponsored education. This is what is provided by the government. Make people see what's not there, but the kind of classrooms, the sort of preparation, all of those things. Make people see the quality of the healthcare that people are receiving. Make people think about their own advantages. That here's just one. So many people who are white have so much more wealth than people who are Black. 10 times more is usually the data point that's given out. Most of that data comes from home ownership, that people were able to buy homes. They were able to have the value, if they were white, they were able to have the value of their homes go up. They often were able to inherit a home, or they were able to have a gift of a down payment from a parent when they bought a home. So this notion of home ownership is just so prevalent. Over 70% of white families live in houses that they own. Black people, they could not have any income for hundreds of years because of slavery, even though they were working. So they were not able to build up any savings. They come out of slavery with more skill than anybody. They built the country, and yet they were not able to translate that skill into businesses because they were denied. And when they did get a business, it was usually destroyed. Think Tulsa. If you don't know about Tulsa, look it up. It's a story that happened all across the country in terms of just destroying Black businesses. There was so much brutality in the South that people left, and I'm talking about after slavery, during Jim Crow, the lynchings. People were getting away from brutality, and they were going north and west thinking they were going to opportunity. When they arrived, banks would not lend them money. Redlining made it clear that they could not get loans to buy mortgages. The only houses people could buy were things that they could piece money together and pay for cash. So they were not able to get home homes. And then when they got homes, they were in communities that did not allow their property to appreciate. So there was nothing left in those houses because they didn't have homes. They couldn't pass them on. They also were not allowed to have jobs where they could build their wealth. So they had no money to pass forward. They were not allowed to get investments in their business ideas. So they couldn't build their businesses. So when you get all of that information, it is clear that this is not a reinforcement of white supremacy. This is an exposure of the evil that has led to that status within society. And that now that we are becoming majority people of color, this is not only the right thing to do. This is not only the moral choice. It has become a democratic and an economic choice. So people need to open themselves up to learning the real truth, no matter how painful it is, not just to be able to beat yourself up and own the ugliness, but to be able to join in the strategies to be able to finally let democracy and the nation live up to its full promise. That's the way to be able to use this, not as a moment to reinforce the hierarchy, but to finally break it down forever.
Thank you. Thank you. Another question from Shelby Cook. You said that activists had a superpower. And indeed, Paul Manasek also left a comment. Thank you for your vision on how we can use data to motivate, activate, agitate, and bring truth to power. So this has resonated with many in the audience. But Shelby asks, and I've heard you ask other folks on your podcast, what is your superpower?
I'm laughing because one of my best friends asked me that the other day. And oddly enough, it was the first time that anybody had thought to turn the question around on me. I don't think I answered her. I just laughed. Now that you have asked me, let me think about it a second. I think that my superpower is being able to listen. Even though I talk a lot, I'm also a really good listener. And being able to listen and try to hear what's behind what people are saying. That's my superpower. Thank you.
Thank you. That's an excellent response. Okay, on to our next question. Nancy Watson, overall, are you hopeful at this time?
Yes, I am hopeful. I am hopeful. I am also afraid because we're at one of those moments. It could go either way. And the it that I'm referring to refers to so many different things. There's so much that could go wrong now. But there's so much that could go right. And I answered the question of being fearful and hopeful at the same time. I lean toward hopeful, and I hope that that's ever be. The other day, I saw the entire NBA on a knee with Black Lives Matter. When I walk through my neighborhood, I see Black Lives Matter signs on the lawn. When I look at corporations rushing to find out what they can do differently, when I finally hear reparations being debated in city halls, getting ready for it to get debated one day in the Congress, after having been around since slavery, all of a sudden this is here. The global sense that this nation has got it wrong. There's a global understanding that this nation has got it wrong, and it has to do with race. This nation does have it wrong. It does have to do with race. It is fundamental. And as we say that, what's interesting is that people understand that you've got to look at what is happening to Black people, which does not diminish or put aside what happened to Indigenous people, what's happening with Latinx, what's happening with Asian. But what people are seeing is there is something so unnatural about the relationship that developed between white and Black people during slavery, because there was this living together that created the standards and the protocols of oppression that impact everybody. So that if you're a person who is, if you're a white person, a white woman with children and poor and you come into a community, you are going to be treated in the way that has been defined by this black-white paradigm. If you have to go on welfare, receive assistance, because those systems were based on an image of a Black woman with a lot of children who was trying to game the system. And so the lack of generosity in it that the white woman experienced is because of the black-white paradigm. That's that system. It's not until we get that fundamentally right that we begin to understand oppression in this country, the oppression of people who are Latinx and the way they're treated and the way that we're treating immigrants who are brown. It all comes from that. And this conversation is coming front and center. We're having it. We're talking about the hierarchy of human value. We're talking about what it means to say Black Lives Matter. That wonderful phrase has forced so many interesting conversations. You know, people say, well, other lives matter. Of course they do. But if Black lives don't matter, no life matters. You could say, well, transgender lives are vulnerable. People have a very hard time. But the people who are transgender who have the hardest time are Black transgender individuals. If people with disabilities have a very hard time, but people who have the worst are Black people with disabilities. Until we understand the way that we treat people who are Black, we are not beginning to deal with oppression and exclusion in America. That conversation has never happened with the level of information and tenacity and interest and sustainability that we see now. That makes me hopeful.
Thank you. Thank you. Our next question from Samantha Breslin, and I think you've touched on this a little, but how can white allies best leverage data to support our Black and Brown communities and the work being done to improve outcomes across the board? How can we use data to raise awareness to this work?
I have answered that question completely, but by your introducing allies, I want to talk about that. The ways that I have talked about using data are the ways that people, no matter what their race or ethnicity or gender, use it to be able to create an accurate picture of where we are, to be able to show people what it's going to take to reach our North Star, to help people measure as we go along, to see the intersectionality of what is going on. We all need to use data in that way. But this issue of white allies is one that I like to be provocative for people and think about this, that while I appreciate that people who are white think of themselves as allies, there is something about that term that suggests that you are joining me in my struggle to deal with my problem. And I would say that the problem of racism is white people's problem. Own it. Create a sense of ownership, which is beyond allyship. Create a sense of ownership of the problem, which is beyond allyship. And try to use data and anything else you can muster to get people to see that. Because in many ways, the best of what is going on is for people to say, oh, this is so horrible, Black and Brown people, let me help you. No, let me help you. You know, this is your problem. You have created this and you are killing yourself, your children, and your nation if you don't deal with it. We all have to own it. We are all in here together. I appreciate allies when they come, but I appreciate complete transformative solidarity even more.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we have enough time for one more question. I think we're supposed to have a little break between now and the next session, but we have a question from Susan Brucci. Thank you so much for your leadership. How do we get to a place of being able to ensure that the data that we are using is really telling the real story, that it's accurate and actionable?
Mm-hmm. We're a long way from there because the data that we're using is the data that we have. And the data that we have is the data that is gathered. And the data is gathered is the data that someone who did not have my agenda in mind when they start putting it out there and together. So the data is inadequate, but we have to use it to be able to make it reinforce a narrative of where it is that we have to go. And then as we have opportunities to be able to add to that data, the way that I mentioned that we're looking within the Latino community, we're looking within the Asian community to talk about different areas where people come from, different identifications that people have. We need to be able, through our work, to identify the data gaps and be advocates for filling them. But we also need to make sure we're wrapping our data in a narrative, that we're allowing people who do narrative work to have access to our data so that they can do that. Some people are only going to produce the data, and that is fine. But we need to be part of a whole community where we're understanding how it helps us with the North Star, how it helps us tell the story, how it helps us do the indicators, how it helps people to be able to see their own problems in ways that are more nuanced, and to reinforce something of what we're feeling. We have a long way to go in terms of getting data, getting it in real time, getting it to the people who need it, making sure that it is disaggregated in the ways that are useful, and connecting it to people who want to make change. And I think spending the time with advocates is always time well spent. Advocates love data, even when it doesn't reinforce their issue. They know what it is they're going to be up against. They know what more they need to know. We're all in this together. I thank you, and good luck to all of you.
Thank you. What helpful wisdom you've been able to shed on so many key caveats and so many key aspects of what we do with our community indicators work. I really appreciate the time you've been able to spend with us and your leadership over many years in this area. Thank you, Angela Glover Blackwell. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
I think now, it's a little awkward being virtual, but we now have time for people to take a quick break before we start our next session. I think we went over just a little bit, but it was time well spent. So thank you all, and we'll see you at the next session.